Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. We'll be looking there in just a moment. Genesis chapter 1. It's good to see each one here this morning. We are looking here at Pepper Road this year at the theme of leadership. And in our first Sunday of the month, we're going through the book of Joshua with a focus on that theme, drawing out some of the aspects of leadership that we see in Joshua as he leads the people to conquer the territory that God has given into their hand. And in addition to those lessons, we want to add additional lessons all along the way, and that's what we're going to be doing this morning. I want to look this morning at leadership in our culture, and particularly failure of leadership. How has leadership broken down in homes, in churches, in communities? What's the cause, particularly, of those breakdowns? And how do we rebuild the structures of leadership? And with that in mind, I want to talk about sober-mindedness, sober-minded leadership, and talk about that not just this morning, but in some lessons that will follow. I think that sober-mindedness is one of the qualities that obviously Paul talks about. We'll get to that. He talks about that in the requirements of a leader in God's church. But I think across the board that it is one of the fundamental requirements of leaders that is so lacking. And it's lacking for a number of reasons. To begin with, I want to talk about order in society. Order as God has placed it, and order as it has been rebelled against in our culture, and really in every culture that has ever existed. But I want to begin with the concept that God created a world of order. That is one of the fundamental aspects of what is happening at creation. You see that comparison at the beginning of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water. So what he is doing in creation is taking something that is disordered and bringing more and more, as you go through the chapter, order to that chaotic picture. And so it says, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. This is part of order, is the separateness. And you see that word come up again and again throughout chapter 1. There's light, there's darkness. He separates the light from the darkness. He calls the light day, the darkness he called night. There was evening and there was morning one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that this was good. And so again, he doesn't use the word separate here, but it's, again, waters, land. Two different things, and we're going to make a distinction between those. God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seeds, fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them." And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, and plants yielding seed after their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them and after their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, there was morning a third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs for the seasons and for days and years. And let there be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. So God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and also the stars. And God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And he continues to go on talking about these distinct things that would carry over into the distinction between man and woman, of course, that we have lost sight of culturally. But all of these things indicate distinctness and separateness. This is a critical element of God's law. All through God's law, he's saying there's separations. I made this and I made this, and don't mix those two things, right? You keep order and distinction among God's creation, and it's shot through God's law. Another element is, as we see the Psalms sort of reflecting back on God's creation, order is a fundamental part of that reflection. In Psalm 104, beginning in verse 5, he founded the earth upon its place so that it would not shake forever and ever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away in alarm. The mountains went up, the valleys went down to the place which you founded for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. He sends forth springs in the valleys. They flow between the mountains. They give water to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Above them, the birds of the heavens dwell. They give forth their voices among the branches. He gives water to the mountains from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of his works. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle and vegetation for man's cultivation, to bring forth food from the earth, the wine which makes man's heart glad, to make his face glisten more than oil, and food which sustains man's heart. The trees of Yahweh are satisfied, the cedars of Lebanon, which he planted, where the birds build their nests, the stork's home is in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats, the cliffs are refuge for the Shephanim. He made the moon for the seasons. The sun knows the place of its setting. You appoint darkness so that it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest creep about. The young lions roar to go after their prey, to seek their food from God. When the sun rises, they gather together and lie down in their dens. Man goes forth to his work and to his labor until evening. Do you see the order that is being described here? Everything in its place. It is just the way God has made it. That as things are going along, this is not some evolved process, but it is a very designed process, and everything is just so, and God has made it so that it is good for man, and so that it is good for the cattle that he created, the animals that he created. Everything is in order. But that order is not just in nature as we observe it, but it extends to the order that we bring to the table. The order that is seen in power and authority, in rulers and leaders among men, and even outside the realm of men. Over in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 16, Colossians 1 and verse 16, it says, "For in him, that is Christ, all things were created both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, where the thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all have been created through him and for him." Thrones and rulers and authorities are things about which men have a natural tendency to chafe at and to seemingly rebel at. And here, in stark language, God says they were made by him and for him. They are his, and they are good, and they have a purpose. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3, I want you to understand, he says that Christ is the head of every man, and man is the head of woman, and God is the head of Christ. He lays out the order of power, the order of authority. If you go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, there's an illustration here, and I think that it is a telling illustration in sometimes the way that we use it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 14, it says, "For also the body is not one member, but many. If the foot says, 'Because I am not a hand, I am not a part of the body,' it is not for this reason any the less a part of the body. If the ear says, 'Because I am not an eye, I am not a part of the body,' it is not for this reason any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But now God has appointed the members, each of them in the body, just as he desired. And if they were all one member, where would the body be? But now there are many members, but one body. And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Or again, the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, how much more is it that the members of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary? And those members of the body which we think less honorable, on these we bestow more abundant honor, and our less presentable members become more presentable. Whereas our more presentable members have no such need. But God has so composed the body, giving more abundant honor to that member which lacks, so that there be no division in the body, and that the members may have the same care for one another. And if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, then all the members rejoice with it. Now you are Christ's body and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, administrations, various kinds of tongues. And then he asks this, are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers, are all workers of miracles? Do you all have gifts of healing? Do you speak with tongues? Do all translate? As you read through that, and especially as we make usage of the beginning part of that passage we just read, we talk about the distinct nature of members in the body of Christ. Here he's particularly talking about the distinct nature of the gifts that various members may possess. And what he's saying is, don't think poorly of people who fall into this category, right? And he associates that with certain parts of the body. That there are certain parts of the body that are not as prominent, that don't get as much attention or regard, and yet you wouldn't want to be without them. They're an important part. But when he gets down to application, he says, are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers? These are positions of authority. One of the things that I think sometimes happens when we're reading through this is what we're saying. We want to put everything on the same level. We just want to make it just a flat surface here. And no, we're not all the same, but in another sense, we are all the same. Can I suggest to you, he is not trying to make everybody the same here. And he is saying there is distinction between this member and that member and the purpose that they serve. And here are positions of authority. And not everybody gets to have the position of authority. But the apostles, though they do have authority, though they do lead, do not have greater salvation than you. And they are not needed where this member is unneeded. We need to appreciate the roles of leaders, and we need to appreciate the roles of followers, but we need to understand that there is a distinctness, there's a separateness to those roles. Sometimes I'll hear someone say when they're getting up to teach a Bible class, I'm not really here to teach this class, I'm just here to sort of participate in the discussion. Can I suggest to you that what you're saying is you have gotten up to not do your job. Your job is to teach the class. And there is a distinction between a teacher and a student, and I don't mean by that. I note here that where Paul is saying not everyone is teachers, he's not saying the students are unimportant, the teachers. It's saying the opposite of that. And yet, there are teachers and there are students. And one of those leads and one of those follows. And so we want to recognize those, appreciate those, and learn which one in any given situation, which one of those we are, and fulfill our role in that place. Men have sought to subvert order, and they have sought to subvert it from top to bottom. In every way that God has brought order, men have sought to bring disorder. And it is because they do not view God's order as beautiful, as good, as kind. They view it as restraining. They view it as unfair and uncharitable. That is the nature of what Job says as he is crying out. And certainly we sympathize with his calamity and the reason why he may think this. But he is saying things that that are not an accurate description of what God has done. He says in verse 23 of Job, the book of Job, chapter 3, why is light given to man whose way is hidden, and whom God has hedged in? This idea of hedged in. God has pressed down and restrained men, and he has put burdens on men and restricted man. Now, of course, as you open up chapter 38, you see that God talks about hedges. He talks about boundaries. And he talks about restraints that he has put on creation. And what he shows in that dialogue is that those boundaries and hedges and restraints and locks are what keep you alive. Let God take away the restraints and see what happens. Well, you don't have to look far to see what happens. You see, as men strip away the order of nature, and they think that the order that is in nature is arbitrary and something to be overcome with technology. And if we get enough technology, then we don't have to acknowledge the separation of man and woman. We can set aside those merely happenstance distinctions. You cannot. That is there for your good. And you will destroy yourself as you try to remove those restraints that God has put in place. But of course, it's not just nature, but it is even maybe more natural for people to chafe at the order and the restraints that God has put in place in the vein of leadership and authority. In Numbers chapter 11, chapter 12. Numbers chapter 12. Moses' siblings come, Miriam and Aaron, it says, spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had taken as his wife, for he had taken a Cushite woman. And they said, has Yahweh indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? And Yahweh heard it. A little bit later, you're going to see, of course, Korah and Dathan and Abiram, who also rise up. And much the same, they rebel against Moses and against Aaron and against their leadership. And who says they get to lead? And God, in both cases, comes in, steps up, and says, me. I said they get to lead. And when Miriam and Aaron say, has God only spoken through Moses? And God says, I speak through him like nobody else. Who do you think you are? And Korah, Dathan, and Abiram stand up and say, cannot we lead? And God says, no, you cannot. And I will swallow you up with the earth itself if you rebel against the authority that I have put in place. That's how serious God is about that order. But man, as I say, has always rebelled against that. It is not confined to biblical history, but of course, it continues on throughout the rest of history. One man after another rebels against what they call the tyranny of another man, only to set in its place another tyranny. Rousseau said, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau had this idea that the problem is society. Society has imposed all of these restrictions, this leadership structure, and if we could just kind of live out in the woods as naked savages, we'd be wonderful people. He looked at the savages who did live around the world and thought, that's the idea. He has nothing to say, incidentally, about their human sacrifice and cannibalism. But he goes on to say, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, this is mine, and found simple enough people to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not any one have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to nobody. There are no leaders. There is no property. Nobody owns anything. Rousseau says this is the way. And God from the very beginning has not said this is the way. He has given land to this one or to that one. He says, incidentally, to Israel, as they are on their way to the land that he has promised them, and they are about to go through the territory of Esau, of the Edomites, he says, you do not take this by force. I have given it to them. It's not yours. And of course, in his very commands, you shall not steal. Don't take what somebody else's. He doesn't say, pull it all up. It's a sham. It's a lie. No, it's order. And it brings order out of chaos. This path, this picture, this egalitarianism, I've brought that up from time to time. I say, egalitarianism, this is where that's, in a modern sense, that thought process is rooted, is in the thought processes of Rousseau. And he lifted up this idea that we need to just break free from the shackles of the ordered society that has been imposed upon us. That found its full fruit in the French Revolution, and they broke free. And guess what? It was far more chaotic than it was before. Now, I don't say that the French society was one that you or I would want to live in, but I guarantee you this, it's one that people wished they could have gone back to once they got out of it. Because then they really saw what life looks like without order. Incidentally, they didn't just try to change the political order. They thought, we're going to break free from God's shackles. We're going to have a 10-day week. What's this ridiculous 7-day week? Do you know that 7 days has no basis in our solar system? That has no connection. There's nothing in creation, it would seem, that points us to a 7-day week. And so they said 10 days makes a lot more sense. It's easier to add up and so forth. So we'll have a 10-day week. Guess what? They could not get the people to hold on to a 10-day week. Why? Because even though there's nothing out there in the stars or the planets to say 7 days, there is something at the very beginning that says 7 days. And what they proved is that you couldn't just throw off God's created order. Not in creation itself, not in the society that God mandated is a part of creation. C.S. Lewis, a couple of 100 years after Rousseau countered with this, he says, I do not believe that God created an egalitarian world. I believe in the authority of parent over child, husband over wife, learned over simple, to have been as much a part of the original plan as the authority of man over beast. God meant for people to lead and for people to follow. And he meant that from the very beginning. We need to be careful that as we have appreciation for democracy and maybe some of the concepts of equality of men, that we do not forget the notion of separation, the notion of authority, and that is a part of creation, that you do not come in. Rousseau thought if you come into life, you should not be bound to any obligations or authority that you yourself don't agree to. That's not it. God says, you come into this world, you take your first breath already having obligations to society, to parents, to the world around you that God made you a part of, to Him ultimately. But of course, this is the story of man from the very beginning. If we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, we see all of this casting off of the authority and order that God has set in place. There's a Jewish rabbi by the name of Edwin Friedman who wrote a book called Failure of Nerve, Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix. In it, he lays out patterns that can be seen everywhere that leadership breaks down. And he reduces those to 5 main patterns that he sees. One is reactivity. He says there's an unending cycle of intense reactions of each member to events and to one another. And this reactivity takes many forms. Some people blow up, others shut down. But whether overreactive and hysterical or passive-aggressive and checked out, the common thread is that the passions of the members govern and dictate both the mood and the body of the body and its direction. That is, that people are constantly reacting and overreacting, and that just shifts things and moves wherever we go. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? There's no stability. Herding, a process where togetherness triumphs over individuality and everyone adapts to the least mature members of the community. Blame displacement, an emotional state in which members of the community focus on forces that have victimized them rather than taking responsibility for their own being and destiny. Quick fix mentality, a desire for symptom relief rather than fundamental change, flowing from a low threshold for pain. And then failure of nerve, a lack of mature and decisive leadership. In Genesis chapter 3, you can see something of all of that. You have a total failure of leadership, that failure of nerve. One of the things that we maybe sometimes don't give a great deal of attention to is the fact that there standing with Eve seems to be Adam himself. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desirable to make one wise, so she took from its fruit and ate. And she gave also to her husband with her. Some of your translations will even put it, who was with her, and he ate. That gives the impression, as you're looking at this unit, this story from the beginning there where the serpent comes up and he says this, and then the woman eats, and then she hands to her husband who's what? Standing right there? Doing what? That's the problem. You see, when the serpent showed up, he should have stepped in. He should have taken the leadership role that God had given him and said, no, we will not. And taken his wife by the hand and walked away. But he sits idly by and he watches her take the fruit. And then, as Paul tells us, he is not deceived. He knows, and yet takes the fruit and eats it along with his wife, following along the least mature member of the community. When God comes up, they have already engaged in the quick fix mentality. They've sewed together some leaves. We'll fix this, and we'll hide ourselves in the garden. Instead of going and confessing their sin to God and looking for some path of reconciliation, they rather, as God questioned them, engage in that blame displacement. And so here's Adam who at first chose Eve over God. He chose her offer to participate in sin over God's plain declaration, you shall not eat. But then when the consequences of that come, he doesn't say, yes, I chose to stand by my wife. Now he throws her under the bus. And can you consider for a moment what that means? The day you eat of it, you shall die. Adam, what is happening? She did it. This is not a love story. This is a coward story. A man who not only followed after his wife, but now is willing for her to be put to death so long as he doesn't have to suffer. So very often, we see people put spins on their capitulation, their failure of leadership, as if it is something noble. But it never is. And so he turns to Eve. She also engages in that blame displacement, turning to the serpent. And what we have, as we have discussed before, is a complete reversal of the order that God had put in place. God had put in place his authority with man under him, woman under man, beast under both of them. Now the beast is leading the way. And the woman is listening to the beast, and the man is listening to the woman, and they have thrown off God's order, and as a result, they have lost all the blessings that come with it. So, we don't want to mess with God's order. we want to figure out not only ways to appreciate it, but ways to reestablish it. How do we restore God's order? I want to look over at Exodus chapter 20. And I want to note in 3 commands a way to look at God's order and how we reestablish it in our homes, how we establish it in churches, how we establish it in communities. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12, the 5th commandment is to honor your father and mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which Yahweh your God gives to you. Commentators have long, and I mean very long, going back to various traditional rabbinical takes, have looked at this command as a foundation for the submission to all legitimate authority. That in telling them to submit to father and mother, this is the building block for submission to all legitimate authority. As one commentator put it, it would include all duties which we mutually owe in our several relations as inferiors, superiors, or equal. The order of the home is a picture of order in general in society. Certainly, we see that in the church as the church is referred to in terms of family. And we structure our churches, we connect them to the order that is in the home, or if we are not doing things well, we connect them to the disorder that is in the home. I think about a household in terms of that order. The family may be illustrated as a body with the father as the head and the family as the body. And so what does that look like? Well, first of all, it means that the head must be present and attached, because a body is not very worthwhile when its head is somewhere else. And so he must be a part of the body. And he must have an idea as to what he wants from the body. He must have goals and vision and purpose for the body. And when a head does not supply the body with those things, then the body rebels. And the body falls into laziness and disrepair and is not able to accomplish any of the things that the head would like to accomplish. And so a father needs to have vision. He needs to be present and communicate that vision. And he needs to be nurturing and training the body to bring it along so that it can accomplish the good purposes that God has given him and to that family. It can also be illustrated as heavenly bodies with the way that gravitational pull works, and the revolving of one body around another, as well as the sun and the moon and the reflection. So you see, first of all, gravity, the pull of one heavenly body on another keeps it in an orderly revolution. And when it falls out of that gravitational pull, it's unmoored and descending into chaos. And so we maintain a gravity in which a head maintains a gravity in which we provide a center. We provide a grounding, an anchor for the family, for the church, for the community that relies on us as leaders. But it can be illustrated in the sun and the moon. And very often we have images of the father as the sun and the wife as the moon. And her job is to take the light that he brings and reflect it and extend it. And we see that, for instance, in Proverbs chapter 31, that's exactly what the Proverbs 31 woman is doing. We can expand that out into other systems of order. You have heads and you have bodies. And the problem is, as we go back to the previous point, that people think there should be no heads, that we should all be leaders. God says it's not so. There are those who lead and those who follow. But it doesn't just affect, it's not just that people think there should be no heads and so that makes it a problem for the leaders. Too many leaders think there should be no leaders. And so that they don't take on their role. So it's not just children are disrespectful to their parents. Parents don't lead. Or they think they should engage in something called gentle parenting. I think you should be gentle. But gentle parenting, ultimately, as you read the literature, means you don't parent. You just join right alongside your kids and become one of them. It is not the way. There is to be separation and distinction. We need to provide vision and gravity to the places where we are called to be leaders. And those who are being led need to feed off of that vision and gravity. And they need to, in order, return even more fruitfulness. As the head plants into us its vision, as it plants into us its guidance, then we take that, we use it, and we make it fruitful. That is what the church is to do for Christ. Another commandment then is you shall not covet. And here's where the disorder comes. Honor father and mother. Don't covet. We maybe reduce covet down to a fairly narrow application. But as we expand that command out, covetousness is being ruled by disordered passions. That idea of being ruled by passions, the idea of passions is in several places in the New Testament. It says in Romans chapter 6 and in verse 12, therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its lusts or passions, many of your translations will say. Ephesians 4 and verse 22, to lay aside in reference to your former conduct the old man which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, the passions of deceit. So you can be ruled by them, you can be deceived by them. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 6, for among them are those who enter the households and take captive weak women weighed down with sins, being led on by various passions or desires. And so you can be led away by them. And then finally in Titus chapter 3 and verse 3, we ourselves were also once foolish, disobedient, deceived, enslaved to various lusts, various passions and pleasures, spending our life in malice and envy, despicable, hating one another. I think at the heart of so much disorder is covetousness, is envious strife. That's Miriam and Aaron. Who makes you? Who gives you the right to be ruler over us? That is societies where people, instead of learning the lesson of Ecclesiastes and contentment with godliness, as Paul talks about, they look over and says, that guy's got more than I do. I think about that in our current country. We live in more lavish and comfortable settings than maybe anybody in history, and yet we are full of looking around saying, but he's got more than I do. And our politics feeds on it. It does not address it and deal with it. It feeds on it. And it runs the leadership as opposed to being led away from those things. Some people will say with regards to this, you shall not covet, in our passions and where we're led and what we like and dislike. You can't help what your heart wants. God says you better. But passions are not just explosions. As we talk about this and being led by our passions, being led by the passions of others, it's not just when we just go into a rage. It is also possible to operate on the slow burn, the constant boil. There are people who rarely explode, but they keep a steady low boil of anger that guides their mood and the mood of the households or organizations around them. They stay in a constant state of anger. There are people who live in fear, and they may not display it in outright panic, but they just stay anxious all the time. And it affects not only their decisions, but the decisions that they have influence over. And so sometimes we think, well, this person's not ruled by passion because they're able to kind of keep it steady. They just stay in steady sin instead of outrageous, explosive sin. They don't throw tantrums. They just kind of fold their arms and pout. And then we go along with what they say because, man, we just don't want to see them pout. And everybody walks on eggshells. And let me tell you, when you're walking on eggshells, you are being ruled by someone's passions. That is not the way to lead. That is somebody else's uncontrolled behavior, or maybe even your own uncontrolled behavior. In contrast, we are called to be sober-minded. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, Paul says, an overseer must then be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate. That word temperate is often translated there, sober-minded. Sober-minded, sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. Down again in verse 11 with regards to women, likewise, he says, must be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate. Again, sober-minded, faithful in all things. Once again, over in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 5. But you, he says to Timothy, be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. As he is talking about these roles of influence and leadership, he is saying one of the qualities, one of the central qualities, is you must have a sober mind. And the sober mind is, it literally is talking about sobriety in terms of alcohol, right? So this is somebody who is not drunk. That's the idea here. And it makes a good illustration, the idea of not being drunk, because drunkenness, it's a helpful illustration, because what it does is mute your ability to navigate your passions. You ever heard that? It lowers your inhibitions. Your inhibitions is what keeps you from blowing up. Sobriety allows you to recognize your passions and to deny your passions. Alcohol doesn't make you angry. It makes you less able to control your anger. It does not make you terrified. It makes you less capable of controlling your terror. It doesn't make you sad. It just makes you less able to work through your sadness. And so, we need to be sober-minded. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and beginning in verse 4, he connects sober-mindedness with awakeness. But you, brothers, are not in darkness, that the day would overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night or of darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us be awake and sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation. That idea of the grogginess, the fog that comes when you wake up. Again, another illustration along with the drunkenness, that we're wide awake. We haven't just opened our eyes, but that we have a clear-mindedness, so that we can recognize disordered passions in ourselves and we can recognize them in others. Over in Titus chapter 2 and verse 2, another element here, he says, older men are to be temperate, dignified, sensible, sound in faith, in love, and in perseverance. There is in these words that go along with sober-mindedness or temperance, here in Titus 2 and verse 2, a stability. Someone who is sober-minded is not a constantly changing person, but somebody that you can rely on, that dignified. He's sensible. He's not going to be tossed to and fro. He's not going to be carried away. If his wife gets upset about something, he's not going to just say, well, she's upset, I got to make sure mama's happy. Or if his children are upset, he doesn't come and say, well, my kids have been saying they've got a problem with, so I'm going to follow after them. He is going to be the person who stays right here as everybody else kind of maybe goes up and down around him, or even will recognize in himself those passions and will work to mute those. So we've got somebody who's awake, who's clear-headed, who's stable, who does not easily move. And then over in 1 Peter, Peter uses this word several times in his first letter. He says in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13, therefore, having girded your minds for action, being sober in spirit, fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Girded for action, be sober. Over in chapter 4, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7, he says, the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be of sound thinking and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. Here it comes. Are you ready? Are you watchful? Down in chapter 5 and in verse 8, be of sober spirit, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Sometimes as we talk about that quality of steadfastness, that immovable element, it can almost come to be thought of as a passiveness. Like, I just don't get worked up about things. Well, a sober-minded person doesn't get all worked up about things. But I tell you what, they are also on the balls of their feet. And they're looking around and they're paying attention. And they are aware of their surroundings. Have you ever been around somebody who has been in any sort of security, police, military? You go into a restaurant and you just notice they're checking things out, looking at the exits, seeing what kind of people are in the place and so forth. They know they're aware of their surroundings. Do you know where we are? Are you paying attention? And so here is part of sober-mindedness. We're not ruled by our passions. This doesn't mean we don't feel. It doesn't mean we're just complete stoics. But it means we can see feelings. We can see what they are, and we can measure them and compare them to truth. And we can avoid being carried away by them. And then finally, back in Exodus chapter 20, we've looked at the 5th command, 10th command, and now coming back to the first command. You shall have no other gods before me. Or to put that in the positive, in the affirmative command, you shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, as Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5 puts it. If God is not the center, if he is not the sun providing gravity to all of us, then we are unmoored and drifting. Even if people are holding on to us, what are they holding on to? Where's our anchor? Right? So you can't just be a leader who says, yeah, the people follow me. Where are they following you? Are you the Pied Piper? Or are you the one leading them to where your anchor is tied to? We tether ourselves to him, and then our leadership roles are ruled by him, so that our rule is stable and secure. It is not enough to be able to say that people listen to me. If I am not listening to God, then that's fairly meaningless. This is how we reestablish God's order. We tie it back to him in the first place, and we constantly look to him as our example. As I said earlier, I've mentioned egalitarianism a few times. It has wrecked our understanding of how a well-ordered life should operate. Instead of always striving to break free from the chains of order, we need to be looking to see how we can put things back in order, how we can exalt God's order. And that starts with recognizing, of course, where the center is. It starts with recognizing who is at the top of that order and then listening to him as we set things in order all the way down. So then the question for you is, have you submitted yourself to his kind and protective order? Or are you still like Job, looking around and thinking that his order is somehow chaos? That the chaos in your life is somehow a result of his imposition, as opposed to his order being the thing that can save you from it. It is a blessing and a protection to put yourself under God's order. And I hope that if you would set your anchor in him, that you would find that your drifting will never bring you safely to land. It's not going to somehow end you up in the right place. but that you moor yourself to Him, to His people, to His authorities, and that is the thing that will get you to where you want to be. If there's anybody that needs to respond to that invitation this morning, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?